Hello and welcome to a new season of Interpreting India. Geopolitical realignments, sustainable growth, healthcare financing, inclusive digital transformations, climate change, supply chain disruptions, urbanization, and several other critical global matters envelop the world as India holds the G20 presidency. We at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. I'm your host, Suresh Rai, and this week I'm joined by Abhishek Anand and Naveen Joseph Thomas to discuss their recent working paper on the man-made clothing sector in India. Abhishek Anand is a consultant with PwC Middle East. Earlier, he has worked at the World Bank as a Robert McNamara Fellow, and prior to that, he was a career civil servant with the Government of India. His research interest lies at the intersection of macroeconomics and economic development. Naveen Joseph Thomas is an assistant professor at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, where he's also the assistant dean for online programs and international collaborations. His research interests lie in the areas of household economics, growth theory, labor economics, and issues of the manufacturing sector. A major puzzle for the Indian economy in the last one decade has been the weak performance in the textiles and apparel sectors. In real terms, the apparel sector has grown marginally, and the textile sector has witnessed a decline. India's share in world trade in textile and apparels has also declined considerably. Between the late 1990s and the early 2010s, India's share in the world trade in these sectors had doubled, as the Indian economy revealed its comparative advantage in a variety of products in these categories. But since then, India's share in textile trade has declined, even as many other countries have increased their shares. The causes for this sudden reversal in a crucial sector are worth understanding. In a recent paper, Abhishek and Naveen offer an analytical explanation of this phenomenon, focusing primarily on certain policy choices that have been made by the union government. Abhishek and Naveen, welcome to Interpreting India.
Thank you, Suresh.
Thanks a lot, Suresh. Thanks for having me for this podcast. I'm very delighted that you took notice of our paper and we're here to discuss it in detail with you. Thanks.
It's a very important paper, and I'm glad you wrote it. And I want to use this opportunity of the podcast to help our audience understand the arguments in the paper and the broader implications of those arguments. So let me start with you, Naveen. Uh, since many of our audience are not experts in the textile and apparel sectors, if you could please start by explaining the basic structure of the value chain in these sectors, which you do in the paper, in terms of what are the key activities that go into producing the final products in these sectors.
Right. So, broadly speaking, a textile uh, uh, can be segregated into or categorized as synthetic or natural fiber based. And for natural fiber base, India has had a very, very long tradition of being a cotton producer. And this dominance is ancient, and that gave us a fairly strong footing in cotton raw material as well as clothing trade all through the centuries till about the time the British colonial powers came into India. We were the leading light there in terms of raw material as well as the fineness and the quality of the material that was produced here. And all of that was done in a fairly decentralized manner. It wasn't done in factories, but it was typically done by farmers who had weaving as an add on source of income. So, this was probably one of those great things about the way textile manufacturing in India was organized. But then there is this whole story of what happened during the British Raj period, at least the first 100 years of that, where India was reduced to just a raw material exporter. And that is what they typically did with all the colonies. And the history of their policies is pretty rich in terms of these examples where they use protection, especially trade protection, to sort of push the colonies to the periphery with them at the core of manufacturing. And that's essentially their industrialization story. Nothing about free trade that they promote right now is part of the story of neither the United Kingdom nor the US in where they have reached, but was the mid 1850s. Slight shift, the East India Company withdrew and with a relatively more peaceful period, we saw government support in terms of the British government supporting Indian manufacturing by providing more advanced machineries, and you see a whole number of new factories and mills being set up post the mid 1850s, and that sort of helped us come back into the picture into textiles. And at the time of independence, we were fairly well placed. But this is all natural fiber, and all of which we have an advantage. We have a comparative advantage because we are a fairly large producer, right? And that has always been the source of our advantage. But the uh, the entire landscape of textiles started changing in the 1950s with polyester coming into the market. Those were initial years, and more commercial production would only happen by the mid 60s. But polyester production really, really took up very quickly. And by the 1990s, we see a reversal in the world markets where the world markets shift towards polyester as polyester and man-made or synthetic fibers as the predominant fiber base for clothing. And cotton just takes a back step post the 1990s, early 1990s. But India on that is an outlier. And for that matter, even Bangladesh, for that matter, is an outlier, where our dominance is still in cotton textiles. And that poses a problem. We might have a very rich domestic market, and there might be demand from the rest of the world, but not as much. And one has to realize that we have to be aligned with um, the requirements of the global markets to be able to gain traction there. And that sort of shifted towards man-made, and we even now are still cotton-based, and that puts our producers at a back foot. And in terms of the value chain, you would typically think of um, the first step as staple fibers. And if it's cotton, then you have the production of cotton ginning, and then you get the staple fiber, and then it's spun, and then you have weaving, processing, and then it goes into the apparel sector. So that's for cotton. And for man-made fibers, typically, if you're talking about of polyester, which is the dominant man-made fiber, you start with petrochemicals. The process starts with xylene. That is the first petrochemical hydrocarbon intermediate. Then you have the purified terephthalic acid and monoethylene glycol, and these are combined to produce polyester staple fiber or polyester yarn, which is filament yarn. You get very, very long filaments. So these are the first steps in the production of polyester, and then they are spun or they are combined with other natural fibers. And that's one of the great things about polyester. It can be combined with other natural fibers to give you a yarn of various qualities. And it can suit multiple purposes. And that's what makes polyester so very versatile in a sense. But the world markets are realizing that we are still stuck, and it's also being stuck with some of our past. There's nothing wrong with that. But the problem is that if you're looking at the world markets, you're targeting exports, that's probably not a winning strategy. And in terms of the polyester value chain, we've always done well at the raw material front, right? Be it natural fiber, or for that matter, we have capacities for even polyester staple fiber. The main problem comes when you go down the value chain. And if I just talk about synthetic fibers, which is the main thrust of our paper, the problem with synthetic fibers is that although you have concentration, high productivity at the production of the staple fiber level, things become very the productivities are low, and production is fairly dispersed and not very efficient once you come down to the weaving and processing part. And that's where we actually lose a lot of competitiveness. Right? And that sort of flows down into downstream industries like apparel. Right? And apparel is low value added and margins are very, very tight. And to compete in the global markets, you're jostling over very, very tiny margins. And every bit of the cost adds up in making you uncompetitive in the world markets. And so the inefficiencies first that probably start upstream are magnified by the time they come into the apparel sector. And apparel sector has been that one key industry which has led to a lot of employment generation through most of the newly developed economies. And we've actually missed out on.
So, two follow-up questions on this. I want to pose these questions to Abhishek and Naveen. Please feel free to add onto this. Why is India an outlier when it comes to man-made fibers? So, I mean, as you said, all over the world, it's basically man-made fibers that have taken over in terms of the production of apparel and textiles, while India continues to still have a dominance of cotton. The other is, why is in the downstream, I mean, manufacturing of apparels and textiles in India so fragmented? Why hasn't large scale, factories and firms come up in that? What would be your explanation, if at all you have an explanation for these phenomena?
I mean, great question, Suyash. I wish we had complete answer. We would have solved the problem. But based on our understanding, we'll just try and answer your question to the best of our ability. So, as Naveen already mentioned, so we are cotton kind of dominated because we are maybe one of the largest producers of cotton. So a lot of our policies to begin with, even after independence, was kind of favoring cotton dominance. And even when kind of polyester took off, our policies were still kind of tailor-made for, was kind of, benefiting the cotton sector and not really the polyester sector. It was changed maybe much later in the late 2000s. We came up with new textile fiber policies where we started to realize that polyester, where the most of the global demand is going to come up. So if you look at the global market, for example, maybe in the 1950s, 1960s, almost 80% was cotton. And, India was doing well because we were also cotton dominated. In 1970s, 80s onward, that starts to change. And by the end of around 1990s, almost 70% is man-made and only maybe 30% cotton. But India continued with cotton, maybe because of, our past. There was already a lot of policies benefiting the cotton sector, and maybe the political economy did not kind of allow us to take a break from what we had been pursuing, because there were a lot of small players, so the whole political economy of vote bank and whatnot comes into play. So we continued with our policy. However, I would still like to highlight, although we were not as good as the global competitors when it came to shifting to man-made, we still realized that in the late 1990s some policy changes, 2000, some major policy changes, which kind of favored maybe the man-made sector. And we started to grow. And in fact, maybe in the 2010s, our share kind of grows from maybe only 20% man-made to almost 40-45% man-made. So of course, India was realizing what the global trend is, and we wanted to be part of that global trend. However, as we'll discuss it later, but whatever the policy changes that happened in the 2010s, because of which it really impacted our kind of global competitiveness when it came to man-made sector. So again, we have gone back to our post-trend. So our kind of share of man-made has again declined from maybe around 40% back to where we were in the mid 1990s. And again, cotton is being more and more dominant over time. So, historical reasons, post 1950s, there was no polyester at that time, and India was a rich producer of cotton. So we continued with kind of, safeguarding our cotton sector, a lot of policies. We could never kind of break away from that because of the whole political economy. Some changes in later years, so we started progressing. But again, in the mid 2005, 2010, again, we go back in terms of policy reversal, which we will discuss later. So we are again back to square one, where again, our competitiveness in man-made has really declined a lot.
Just to add to that, I think most of this stems from the concern about textiles and apparel stems from our general performance of manufacturing. And we've always counted in the Louisian framework to figure out, well, what is the labor oriented way to develop. In a sense, we are talking about a large pool of labor sitting in agriculture. How do we move them out of agriculture and increase productivity overall in the economy? And I think missing links are labor intensive industries in manufacturing, which for some reason haven't worked well in India. And textile and apparel being the prime target. And we're wondering, like, we have been historical superpowers there. What went wrong? And what precisely went wrong was policy. And I think if you talk about dark phases for the Indian manufacturing sector, I would call the 70s the dark phase for Indian manufacturing sector. Same for textile policy. For, as Abhishek was saying, we had a textile policy which completely neglected polyester for a large part up to 1985. For that matter, there are discussions. There are pieces in EPW where industry leaders of polyester are worried about polyester being banned altogether and synthetic fibers being banned altogether in India. Now that was a time when synthetic fibers were taking. Those were the initial years of growth in synthetic fiber production, and then you have uncertainty at that point, which automatically puts us at a back. So policy was very critical at that, critical, and that sort of dragged us down. And that was also the time when most of the fragmentation in most industries came. So textile and apparel is no exception. All our industries are fragmented, and fragmentation is a phenomenon that came with the small scale industry reservation policy. And what happened was the more efficient producers, which would have been these mills, were completely they were completely destroyed in the 1970s and the 80s. And what led to is the powerloom sector, which grew on the protection that handlooms had, and they pretty much took over the entire market. And that is the source of fragmentation in the textile sector. And all of that can be traced back to the 70s. And we haven't been able to grow out of that.
Right. Now, this is an interesting story because there is, if you were to tell a big history of these sectors, we had centuries of dominance. Like we read in memoirs about how uh, fine Indian fabric used to travel to West, and in exchange for precious metal and other things because it was so so valuable. But then you see a period of some decline during the colonial era. Then again, some recovery once the East India Company is kind of replaced by the crown, and some degree of industrialization happens. Some modern technologies are introduced, and when India becomes independent, about 11% of world trade in these products is, India's share. But then the decline starts, as you rightly mentioned. It goes on for a few decades, arguably for 3.5 decades or so. But then there's a recovery, right? You've shown in the paper also that there's a significant recovery in terms of real GVA as well as our share in the world trade. So, can you describe to us what that recovery of period was and what did we achieve during that before we come to the last 1 decade, which is basically the primary focus of the paper? I mean, uh, Naveen, if you want to take that.
So I think one of the key reasons for the growth in the man-made or the synthetic textiles was also, there was reasonable growth in the 90s and the 2000s. And I think there was a fair amount of role that our trade policy had. I think we went from a high tariff regime to a low tariff regime, and all through the 2000s. early first decade of between 2000 and 2010, we had a relatively low tariff regime. And I think that was the period where the global economy was also doing well. And with that, the markets opening up, textile being apparel being de-reserved, we see growth in both textile and the apparel sector. But and this continued till about 2014 to 18, was relatively well a freer trade regime. And I think our textile and apparel sector benefited from that. But things started going south for polyester, at least in 2014, where uh, you had anti-dumping duties being imposed on uh, fiber intermediates, and that's particularly PTA. Right, anti-dumping duty on PTA isn't new. Right, we had anti-dumping cases going on in 1998, then 2000, and that is understandable because one can think of that being an infant industry at that time. Right, and if we follow Frederick List, I don't think any industry in a global economy can grow without some protection. Right, and all of the developed world has done that, and we shouldn't be told to do otherwise. But the problem is that that was in 2000, right? And most of these anti-dumping duties were not for a very prolonged period. These were usually for very short durations, didn't continue forever, because anti-dumping duties are renewed every 6 months. They are reviewed every 6 months. But in 2014, uh, the anti-dumping duty that was introduced on PTA, when PTA were we when to begin with, we are dependent on world imports for PTA. We don't produce all the PTA that we require domestically. You have an anti-dumping duty being imposed, and that going on till 2020. It close to 6 years of anti-dumping duties, and then there is a tariff hike in 2018. Now, both of them combined led to well, all of the fiber intermediates becoming extremely expensive, right? And probably one of the few people who could have benefited from that are integrated polyester manufacturers like Reliance, who have their base in hydrocarbons. They produce their PTA, they produce monoethylene glycol, which again is an intermediate. They produce all of that. Then that goes into, they're also polyester staple fiber producers, and now one of the largest integrated polyester staple fibers in the world. Right, so they benefited for sure, but uh, producers like Indorama, or for that matter Bombay Dyeing, who depended uh, on the markets for providing fiber intermediates, they suffered, and all of that led to one has to also remember that this was also a time when petroleum prices were falling. So in net, what happened is, and we showed this in the paper, that compared to the rest of the world, much less of that decline in crude oil prices was transferred to the producers because of the anti-dumping duties, right? And in 2018, that becomes a whole lot more worse with the tariff hike.
Right. Abhishek, if I can just pull you into this as well, from a policy making perspective, obviously people, economists disagree a lot on the infant industry argument and in what context that argument works, what context it should be converted into policy, what should be the precise contours of the protection that is given to infant industry and all. But by most measures, by 2014, these were not infant industries. I mean, especially the people who are producing PTA, polyester, were not. I mean, I wouldn't argue that they were infant industries. If you look at the production scale, their share in world trade, and all of that, but still the decision was taken. So, have you had a chance to consider what was the rationale given when the petitions were filed to impose these duties, and the petitions were accepted and the duty was imposed? What was the rationale that was offered at that time?
Yeah. Also, just linking it with the question that you asked earlier, and then how maybe the two things kind of correlate. So, there was a period of growth. India was doing pretty well, both cotton as well as man made. And it starts in the late 90s when we kind of really reduced our tariff rate. So, we went to a regime where up till about maybe 2015, 2016, we were continuously declining. We were on a spree to kind of cut down or rationalizing our tariff rates. At the same time, of course, the global economy, especially the mid 2005, till about maybe 2011 12, there was a hyper globalization. So we kind of benefited from both the policies. Now, the rationale, as what really happened is that there's a big player when it comes to the key intermediary which goes into polyester making, which is PTA, and it basically is a byproduct of petrochemical. You refine and you get it. And there are as you know, there are very few players in India who are in refinery business. So the infant industry, as you said, it still makes sense if there's a lot of small players, big domestic market, and you would want to kind of promote competition, whatnot. That was not the case when it came to PTA. For some reason, for which we have not answered to, and we have tried a lot, basically starting from around 2011, Reliance, which is the biggest producer of PTA, it faces some issue, and there's a huge decline in the production of PTA. We have tried a lot what potentially could be a reason, but we don't have a sufficient answer. So that's when kind of, because textile is so dependent on PTA. PTA alone accounts for 70% of the overall input that goes into polyester making. So there was a huge surge in import, and we started importing a lot. And that's when the lobbying kind of started. This PTA manufacturer, they came together, they started petitioning that how there is cheap import available from some other countries, and it is kind of killing their business. Now, if you look at the ruling, I mean, uh, at least what is publicly available, of course, I'm sure there's a lot of back and forth consideration, whatnot. We don't have answer to all the detail uh, of the rationale why finally, whatever the lobby was there and they asked for it and it was approved. But this was the key thing that, okay, the cost of production is higher, but then these countries are kind of importing it at as low, the usual kind of anti-dumping argument that goes into, which is not true, because the low prices that we see at which we were importing, that was not something sudden that started happening only in 2011. Those prices were always there. And at least for me and Naveen, just based on the facts which are available on the public domain, it doesn't make sense that why would you approve. And it's also something also very interesting for us, because it picks out countries that, okay, if you are importing from this particular company in South Korea, this particular company in Thailand, then anti-dumping, and these companies alone accounted for more than around 90% of the import that came from these countries and these particular companies. And later China was added. From China, we do not import a lot. The key countries are basically South Korea and Thailand, from where we import bulk of the countries. So also there's a pattern in how we are kind of picking countries and which companies are being picked for imposing import tariff. All these details, as you know, usually are not available publicly. I'm sure there was some rationale behind it, but based on whatever is available, we don't understand it. So basically,
Who takes a decision? I mean, just for my knowledge, who issues the order on this? Which authority?
So it's the Director General of Trade Remedies. So typically, interested parties will file an application for a anti-dumping duty, and then there is very rigorous investigation that goes in, and then in usually I think about 6 months to 1 year, typically decisions are made. And what is also interesting is, just to add on to what Abhishek was saying, the anti-dumping duty on PTA was at the turn of the last political regime in 2014, just at the turn of that, and there is a sense of hurriedness with which that anti-dumping duty was imposed.
Is it a reasoned order that they issue? Like, do they explain the investigation? Do they give the economic rationale for it properly, or is it just a one-page order?
They provide all economic rationale, which doesn't quite add up adequately.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking from pure trade perspective. I mean, you are in an industry dealing with an industry where there is a monopolistic competition. There are very few kind of players, and there's a huge market concentration. Maybe these two three companies alone account for 70-80% of the overall production. So, I mean, tariff protection in an industry where you basically have a monopolistic competition, it doesn't make sense. Basically, what will happen is that even if your argument is that we want to provide tariff protection so that our industries can grow, there is small players coming up. That is not going to happen in a market like PTA where there is a huge market concentration. Basically, what will end up happening is that small players, they take advantage of it, and the market concentration will kind of will keep increasing. So that's why intuitively, to us it doesn't make sense. There is not enough, at least in the public domain, that the ruling that is there, apart from the standard anti-dumping, that you are violating anti-dumping because these companies are kind of importing these products at a rate which is maybe cheaper than what maybe the cost of production may be. But there, I mean, I don't see there is enough evidence to back that up. These companies, the PTA globally, they were kind of exporting to other players, other countries as well, at almost the same prices. India was not an outlier in that sense. So it would be interesting for me to kind of maybe if we can get hold of the detailed ruling, what really went in behind the decision making, and also it was only for 6 months to begin with. Uh, it was it went on for 6 years. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. And as I told you that, other countries took benefit of it. This was the time where maybe we're still market leader. I mean, after China, doing better than Bangladesh and Vietnam. But post that, there is a reversal. Man-made, we start losing market share. First stagnation, and then we start losing market share. So it had, I mean, yes, one can argue that you can't just say that just one policy is responsible for all of it. People will say that, okay, land reform or labor reform, those are the things, but those are constants, right? Throughout last 30 years, 40 years, labor reform being rigid, there is no change, or land reform or power tariff being high, they were always there. There's one variable change, which is this particular
Yeah, to explain something that is changing, you have to see something that has changed. So, yeah, I mean, when we come up across these kind of decisions, sometimes we euphemistically say that the causes are not economic but political economic. So that broad phrase we just use to explain what's going on. But it's still worth understanding the reasoning that was at least offered publicly, because they're public institutions and they're supposed to explain their decisions.
There was a fair amount of kickback by the polyester producers. Indorama being very vocal about it, and Bombay Dyeing was the other major.
You mean pushback? If you say kickback, then you have to back it with evidence.
Yeah, a major pushback from the polyester producers who were on the receiving end of the anti-dumping duty. And it's interesting that it leads to second order problems, because in 2017, these producers also applied for anti-dumping duty on polyester staple fiber, which was obviously rejected in 2000 in 2018, beginning of 2018. It was that case was disposed. But you see what is happening, right? So you have big producers, and all of synthetic staple fiber production is extremely concentrated, right? And any protection there is not going to increase competition, and that's standard basic economics. It's not going to increase competition. It's just going to make those markets very concentrated, and that we actually see from data when we calculate concentration indices. We calculate the Hirschman-Herfindahl index for the polyester staple fiber production in India from 2014 to 19. We see an increase in concentration.
Yeah, I mean, a huge increase. You showed zero point 0.4 to zero point 0.9 is the HHI. That's almost, it's now basically a couple of companies.
one has to realize that this market is already concentrated. 0.25 is the threshold for highly concentrated market. For a market which is already concentrated, which becomes all the more concentrated, right? And think about this: you have these large producers upstream, right? Be it staple fiber production, or for that matter, a PTA production or staple fiber production. But as you move downstream, the market is fragmented, right? And fragmentation also will. This is part of our old policy overhangs that we have. That that defragmented market is responsible for a large number of livelihoods and is a fairly large employment generating sector. Now, the interest of that sector is being put at stake for the interest of a couple of industries which probably don't need that much protection.
So then what happened once this anti-dumping duty is imposed in 2014 and then tariff is increased in 2018? What is the decline in real GVA as and in India's share in world trade? Just for basic information for people who have not read the paper.
Yeah, so in 2013 is when in October there's a huge anti-dumping which is imposed on PTA, and so what you would see is that first, I mean, it doesn't impact maybe much because firms could import polyester, at least the apparel ones. If we come to apparel now, they could import polyester, and it didn't impact them much. So the apparel, at least the apparel sector, it continued to grow, although it was imposed till about 2015, 16, maybe 2000, yeah, till 2017. There's some impact, of course, of global economy coming down, so export because of that. But otherwise, it was doing pretty well relative to other countries, and we were gaining market share. I don't have the numbers at the top of my head. Maybe I can just quickly check it. But yeah, I mean, we were still gaining. So what then happens is in 18, when the government decides what they call, Atmanirbhar Bharat, or self protection. So 2018 is the year when PTA hike is also followed by a huge hike in polyester. It used to be around, I think, 7.5% the import tariff. It goes up to around 20%. So that's a huge hike. And that's when you would see is that apparel sector, it starts declining. And since then, not just market share, but even the absolute productivity has kind of declined by around, maybe there's a 5 to 7 percentage points decline in the productivity, and maybe around 2.5 percentage point in the global market share in apparel. And it is especially important because all this is happening when China is vacating this space. China is moving up the ladder, wages are going up. So, I mean, it can't really be competitive when it comes to textile, or apparel, or other labor intensive products. And you must have seen this famous chart, which recently was there in the Financial Times, that how China is losing market share. And we would have been, actually, if not maybe for this policy, we would have kind of gained, uh, and we would have captured some of the market share. But that did not happen. And all of that has gone to Vietnam and Bangladesh. In fact, even countries like Germany, much richer than us, the niche product, high within textile, whichever, or apparel, high productivity value products, they have gained market share, and we have not been able to. And this is a very important question, because even going forward, this trend is going to continue if no reversal happens now, because China is, again, will vacate space in labor intensive. It will move up, capital intensive and whatnot. It will continue to do well, but not in labor intensive. And we do not see any sign as of now if we have been able to kind of benefit from whatever space China is vacating. So this is something, matter of concern. But I'll give some credit to government here. I think there is a realization that, okay, this is happening. We already see some reversal. For example, the PTA, whatever, for 6 years, 6.5 years, it kept on being extended. Finally, government decided not to do it. In the latest budget, there is a lot of tariff cuts, especially on polyester. They have again gone back from 20%. I don't know the exact number where it stands now, but there is a substantial cut in tariff rate.
5% now.
Yeah, so it has come down. Now I don't understand like how all of a sudden, just in say 3 years, 2018, there's a sudden reversal. What we had been following post 1990 is still about 2018, and the government realizes that okay, we need to whatever protect our industry, and you reinstate it. And within 2 to 3 years, you are going back on what you had done. You're basically undoing what you did in 2018. So I mean,
After the damage is done, I guess.
yeah, but at least
There is some learning is happening. That's a good thing itself.
yeah, but at least they are doing it. Yeah, Naveen, if you want to add something here.
Yeah, just to add to this, I think I'm not patently against tariff protection, but tariff protection needs to be sensible. You cannot have tariff protection across the board and then sort of hope everything to work out really well. And I think in 2018 we got the tariff protection wrong in terms of having that inverted duty structure where all the inputs were very heavily had very high import duties. And I think what's seen now is that's a reversal of that. You still have high tariffs for final goods like woven fabric, but for PTA, staple fiber, filament yarn, and all the intermediates, you see a decline in the tariff structure. Now, while we were in the initial years of 2000s, when our tariff structure was being came down quite drastically, we were still around 7.5, 10%. I think around 10%. But while all our competitors were at 5%. Right? So now the reversal that we see is going back to a fairly low tariff regime for all intermediates so that you can have the more fragmented bits of the value chain now benefiting from that, and probably we'll see some consolidation and building of capacities. But I think we are moving into an entirely different conversation on what should be done.
Yeah. No. First, let's understand what happened, just for because it's good that some of this has been reversed, and many people were writing about the inverted duty structure even in 2018 and 2019 and 2020. It took a while for the system to learn and undo that damage to some extent. But one finding from the paper that you have highlighted is that the decline in productivity can be explained uh, basically by decline in productivity of the top firms, the most highly productive firms in terms of labor productivity. Why? Why is that? Why were those firms disproportionately affected by by these policy decisions?
Yeah, maybe I can start and then Naveen can jump in. So, and that's where I mean, this is a great insight also into why we need to allow these firms to import at a competitive price, because the if you are able to import at competitive prices, you're also more competitive in the external market. Now, what happens when you raise the tariff rates? I mean, these are the companies, the most productive ones, who are relatively at a receiving end. The reason being, if you look at the data, these companies who are more competitive, who export more, they also import more. And because of whatever reason, they're bigger in size, they can also kind of import at a cheaper rate. It makes sense for them to, rather than procure locally, which is maybe not of high quality, or maybe the prices are high, they would rather kind of import it from external market. And they are at the receiving end because they have to now pay higher prices. And finally, their productivity declines. They are now no more as competitive as they used to be earlier, and they lose global market because I mean, standard trade policy is that I mean, the most productive ones and tend to be larger, and they export more, and that's the same thing which is going on here. These are the more productive ones, where larger in size, employment size, and otherwise as well, and they're also the import share in their overall inputs that were being used was much higher, and their import kind of declines because now, I mean, whether you import or you procure locally, it's all the same because prices kind of are at parity now. And that's why you would see that relatively there is a larger decline in their productivity. In fact, the smaller ones, they are not much affected because earlier also they were kind of procuring locally and they continue to do the same, so their productivity remains not it doesn't get affected. It's these big ones who were in the exporting business, their productivity gets affected, they lose the market share. And that's what you see in the data as well, that and it's concerning for us because we are kind of putting an additional tax on our most productive firms who should be incentivized to grow. They are creating more jobs, given the job situation that we have in India. But we are putting an additional tax on them, and because of which we are not able to also maybe create as many jobs as we could have done or we were doing earlier. And our potential is, and you see that all of a sudden they're also in terms of employment size or overall output, the kind of growth that we're witnessing earlier, it declines once they have to pay these additional taxes on importing these key intermediaries.
I just want to discuss a little bit about the political economy of these sectors. And like I look at some of the sectors, for example, if you look at airports and civil aviation sector, the regulator is so there's a regulator called Airport Economic Regulatory Authority. It sets tariffs for airports, and the higher the tariff, the better it is for the airports, and the lower the tariff, the better it is for the uh, aviation companies, basically the airlines. And but because both sides are very powerful, it because they're large corporations and conglomerates on both sides, there is some sense of balance when it comes to interest group politics of the regulator. Now, here in this, it seems like the downstream manufacturers are significantly fragmented and smaller enterprise. There are a couple of big ones, but even they are not as big as the. And plus, the downstream includes the integrated firms which actually make the intermediate goods as well as the final goods. But the upstream, which is basically the fiber polyester fiber makers, are now even more highly concentrated. They were anyway concentrated when the anti-dumping duty was enforced, and now even more highly concentrated. So these are structural facts as of now. These can change, of course. The downstream manufacturers can also grow, and there can be consolidation, as Naveen was mentioning. It could happen, and then perhaps there'll be some more balance in the interest group politics in these sectors. But given this, what is the kind of public administration uh, response that say as a policy wonk? Maybe Abhishek, you can answer the question. Naveen, you can also add, is required to be able to make sound policies in this kind of sector, because it seems like both of you agree that what happened in 2014 was not justified based on economics, at least from what is available in public, but may have been something else that is driving it. And it can happen again because now even there's greater concentration of power in the upstream sector, market power. But it should be relevant in tradables, because if it's tradables, then there will be a global competition, even if you have some constructed some measure of dominance in domestic economy. But it's a sword that is hanging all the time, because again similar arguments can be made, and again some such decisions, maybe not tariff related anti-dumping, but some non-tariff related measures could be taken, which could basically disadvantage the downstream manufacturer, but benefit the upstream kind of fiber manufacturers and PTA manufacturers and so on. So, how do you think about this as a policy wonk, and somebody who's worked in government and has been part of policy making?
Here, I would give two examples. How Bangladesh is maybe dealing with it and how Vietnam is dealing with it. And maybe I also am working with the government in Tamil Nadu on power reforms there. I'll bring an example from there. They have set up a committee under Dr. Arvind Subramanian. So some insights from there speaking to all textile industry. Now it's a fact that the problem, as we said, is starting from PTA, where you have huge concentration, and that's not going to change because, as I said, it's a byproduct of crude oil refinery. You cannot expect too many players there. It's so capital intensive. It is always going to be there. The market concentration is always going to be there. And PTA is also not a main product for, It's just a byproduct. Their business is something else. PTA happens to be whatever, a byproduct from which they kind of they sell and make money. But for whatever reasons, government kind of decided to protect PTA rather than maybe where they should be. Even if you have tariff protection, those kind of things, you should have been thinking about maybe textile or about apparel rather than PTA. Now, what happens in Bangladesh, for example, they don't even care about textile. Their thing is that the final product. So even, for example, even polyester or textile is finally an input to apparel, and they don't have the capacity to build textile sector now. So they kind of just import everything and they just focus on apparel. So their tariff policy is in a way is designed in a way where the whole focus is just on the final product, which is apparel. Forget about all the intermediaries and just focus on apparel. And they have been successful. Yes, I mean, one can argue, should you be just so much dependent on one sector? Their manufacturing overwhelmingly is dependent on apparel, very few sectors coming up. But setting that aside, that's the path that they have chosen, that just focus on one sector, which is apparel, forget about all the intermediaries. Vietnam does equally good in both textile and apparel. So what they have done, they have of course made sure that whatever inputs that are needed for textile, they are. I mean, in fact, they charge 0% for most of the inputs that go into manufacturing textile. So they have a good textile base, as well as now they're doing well. Again, for they make sure that the tariff structure is not inverted, unlike in India. So even if they have finally some tariff rates that goes into manufacturing apparel, but they have made sure that the tariff structure is right. So they have kind of benefited out of it. But this is just the tariff part, that what should be done. So where you should be maybe imposing tariff, where you should not be imposing tariff. But tariff is not the only thing which is important. Yes, you can make some improvement by all of this. There are other key things. For example, how much power, how much tariff you have to pay for power. What is the infrastructure in terms of how easy you can move your goods from factory to industry, the logistical details. And Tamil Nadu is an example there, what really happened and how Tamil Nadu benefited, just sheer stroke of luck. So the tariff rates, we know that power, whatever we have to pay in India, is pretty high relative to global competitors. And of course, because we try to bring an element of social justice with everything which is available. Every tariff we kind of said, okay, free for poor, high for others. So even power, what happens that domestic virtually is, domestic charges are very low, much lesser. Even the richest person would pay maybe 80% of what the cost of production is. But we penalize commercial units and industrial units and set very high tariffs. Now in around 2008, it was true for Tamil Nadu as well. 2008, for some reason, there was a huge power crisis. And basically, the DISCOM was not able to kind of supply the demand that was there. So the government kind of changed the policy altogether and they allowed open access. So, if you have a 1 megawatt and above, I don't remember the exact number, but a fairly liberal number, then you can have your captive generation. And once that constraint was released, there was a huge exit of industrial units who were procuring electricity from the state DISCOM. Then they started generating on their own. And in fact, now 55% of the industrial electricity which is demanded, it comes from open access market. All of them have exited from the state DISCOM. But it was just sheer luck because government was forced to allow the firms to do it because they were not able to generate enough power. But and of course, the manufacturing in Tamil Nadu benefited because of it. Still, I mean, we do not do that well in manufacturing, but Tamil Nadu does much better than maybe most of the other states. And one change was this. So this shows how not just import tariff, but even in some of the key things like power or ports, where government has to, these are difficult also. These are also difficult things to import. I mean, tariff, you can quickly come up with rules and regulations, but the harder things like, rationalize power rates, politically difficult because you have to then raise higher tariff from domestic consumers so as you do not have to cross subsidize other segments like industrial and commercial units. infrastructure, government is yes putting focus, maybe in future it will yield result, but again, these are difficult things to do. Land reform, again, key area, because you have, I mean, the land parcel size on an average is small in India. You set up a firm, you have to deal with too many people in India, too many landowners in India. And there's a very nice paper which kind of quantifies the impact of land reform. Labor reform, people say, is, big constraint, but because there is this element of you can still hire contractual labor, a lot of that constraint is kind of released, and there's new paper coming up which shows that maybe labor is not that big a constraint, because you have this option of contractual labor. But then again, land, power, infra, these are things really matter a lot. It pushes up your cost of production, and power. The Tamil Nadu example basically shows us that how these things can really matter. But these are also harder things to do. But this is where government should be focusing more, and not just on tariff part, because those are easier things to do, maybe politically not that difficult. But yeah, I mean, we have to learn our lessons if we want to really kind of reverse some of the things that we have done in the past. We want to make sure that our manufacturing grows. Uh, you have to implement all these things no matter how hard. And for this government which came up with a strong mandate, one would have thought that they could have pursued it given the strong mandate that they had. But we don't see some of these critical areas, that much progress. Hopefully things will change, and we will see positive steps being taken. Some of the things have been done, but a lot more has to be done.
And Naveen, if you can just add to this, but focus a little bit more on the trade policy side, and of course, anything else that you want to add in terms of how the government should consider in terms of giving a boost to the sectors, but in a manner that is pro competition and allowing for a free and fair kind of a market condition. And I mean, also in addition to that is that you said that some of the inverted duty issues have been kind of reversed in the last couple of years. But is the current duty structure more or less in line with what you would recommend?
Okay, thanks, Suresh, for that question. Now, I think we definitely did get the tariff policy and our trade policies wrong roughly around 2018. That it was horribly wrong. And I think that was counterproductive. And as Abhishek pointed out, we see our competitors zooming past us, especially in the apparel sector. Well, they had zoomed past us in textile much earlier, but in apparel, we see that happening all through the last decade. Now, what's important to note here is that there have been a lot of corrective measures. Now, for example, after the PTA anti-dumping duty was revoked in 2020, in 2022, another anti-dumping duty case was ongoing on MEG, that is monoethylene glycol, which is another key intermediate and which is about 20% of input used for polyester staple fiber. But that was struck down. Right. And at the same time, we also see that now there is ongoing investigation on, I think, polyester yarn. There's a demand for anti-dumping duty on that. But I think the mandate has shifted. And the damage done by inverted duty structures is very clear. And I think that has been corrected. As on 5th of May 2022, we see that inverted duty structure not being there anymore. And for inputs, it's reasonably low. And the larger question is that the damage has been done. And international markets are not open markets where changes in domestic policies can very quickly translate into higher exports. There is we have to negotiate with global value chains, and we've been traditionally fairly weak on that. And whether the damage can be reversed now is a larger question. And I think it'll have to be policies, as Abhishek rightly said, will have to go way beyond just tariff policies. We'll have to go to the larger structural issues that the manufacturing sector has faced. And I think a lot depends upon what the policy focus is. Now, getting to probably 25 percentage of manufacturing GDP can be achieved by multiple routes. One can be uh, just get larger businesses to join in, and then you have high growth in those businesses because they have the ways and means to adopt the best of technologies from across the world. Or you can think of the harder thing to do, which is a more equitable and non trickle down sort of a route of achieving that 25 percentage of manufacturing sector growth, which may not be very easy and will require very, very active participation of the government in terms of supporting the very, very, sorry, I say defragmented, what I mean is fragmented value chain in processing and weaving. And that'll also require a lot of technology transfer to happen, cluster-based policies to build economies of scale, so that we can at least on the productivity side get things right, and work on figuring out how we can get better penetration into the global value chains, which is another major issue and a cause of why we probably aren't doing as well as our competitors.
I mean, if I can just add a couple of points here. I mean, we missed one important point here, which is yes, some of these tariff reversals have happened, which is good, but the level still, I would say that maybe it can come down further. But one problem is that for whatever reason we believe that we have a huge domestic market, so we don't really need to cater to the world market, which is because maybe our population size. But the papers which show, especially there's a recent paper by Somitro Chatterjee from Penn State, where they show that the domestic market may be yes big in terms of population, but number of people who have the purchasing power to kind of consume some of these goods is fairly low. Maybe 15% of the population can actually be classified as middle income and above, who can maybe buy Indian some of these products. So, I mean, this thinking which maybe the government has, and that's also the push behind self-reliant or Atmanirbhar Bharat, is that our domestic base itself is strong, which needs to change. And that was the reason why we did not maybe pursued signing free trade agreements. Some of the key trade agreements we kind of backed out. We did not join the bandwagon, and that's important. Yes, now some progress there with UAE. Maybe we have signed, but maybe. Labor intensive and maybe textile UAE, you are not going to benefit much. But these kind of things have to be pursued. This thing of that self-reliant, just cater to domestic market, that needs to change. And for that, it's important that we continue to sign free trade agreements. Like we backed out from RCEP. I think we should have been part of that. We are losing out on the global market. So apart from just the tariff rates, we also have to kind of capture this global market, which other countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam, they have signed free trade agreements with other countries. And that's also one of the reasons why they have been able to capture market. The second thing is this PLI, which they have. One thing is we can argue whether good or bad, but for now, if we assume that, okay, it is good, most of it goes to capital intensive sectors. Almost around 85 to 90% of the outlays for capital intensive sectors. And in capital intensive sectors, we have actually been doing better since independence. As paper again, the Somitro Chatterjee paper shows, post independence, when it comes to capital intensive exports, 1995 till date, India is the third largest. We always feel that, okay, India doesn't do well when it comes to manufacturing, but actually there's a clear distinction between capital intensive and labor intensive. In capital intensive, we have done pretty well. Since 1995 till to date, we would rank as the third highest exporters in terms of growth rates. But PLI again focuses only on mostly on capital intensive, not much focus on maybe labor intensive. So PLI, the structure should be such that it kind of maybe there's some outlay, much more outlay for labor intensive sectors like textile, and B, this thing that okay, just domestic market size is big enough, I think that needs to change, and we have to pursue signing free trade agreements, because other countries especially our competitors, Bangladesh and Vietnam, they have been doing, and they have been capturing newer and newer market. And India should also do that. We missed out on maybe RCEP, but that should not be the case going forward. Maybe, we have it with UAE right now, but this is not something where textile would benefit or apparel would benefit a lot. But we need to continue to sign with other countries as well.
Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you, Naveen.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one a bit of insight. Now, when we talk about the value chain, one has to figure out where is it that you want to expand the market, and what probably is in line with the larger mandate of what you expect that industry to deliver to you. Uh, for example, I think all through right prior to 2020, I think the problem was that there were too many voices even within the value chain, and it wasn't clear who is where is the policy focus? Is it on final goods or is it on intermediate goods? And that the inverted duty structure precisely reflects that. But I think there is clearer understanding that value addition, and we are very uniquely placed compared to most other countries. We have the entire value chain domestically, and that's rare, right? And I think the political mandate on whether it's intermediate inputs that we want to cater to the rest of the world, or whether it's the final good that we want to cater to the rest of the world, is a key policy decision that needs to be made. And I think it's somewhat clear now that we are focusing on the end product, on the final goods. And I think that's a good move. And I think that's at least part of the problem solved, that you're clear on where you want to push policies. And I think the employment issue is still a very large looming problem. And the jobless growth that we've faced is still it's something that's of great worry. And I think policy should be focused there rather than focusing on capital intensive sides of the value chain. The labor intensive sides need to be focused on now. And I think that should be the broader goal as we decide on policies, because getting that bit clear is probably very, very important in deciding a whole host of policies to cater to that mandate.
Thank you for those comments. I mean, thank you, Abhishek and Naveen, for first writing the paper, this very important paper, and secondly for joining me to discuss this paper, so that we can understand where you're coming from and what are the broader implications of the arguments that you make in the paper. I think it's a good paper that actually highlights the important to understand the difference between the theory and practice of economic policies. Sometimes economics would suggest a certain course of action, but the political economy would lead the policymakers in a different direction. That's why it's important for government to, I mean, we as citizens to ask that the government reason its decisions, explain its decisions in detail, give, give the rationale for the decisions, study the impact of the decisions on an ongoing basis, so that course corrections can be made at the right time. And often what we see in India in terms of whether it's a broader developmental objectives or specific objectives like increasing production and manufacturing in India, is that we see decisions but we don't see the rationale behind the decisions. So an open dialogue cannot happen about it. So in March 2020, they launched PLI schemes for three sectors. And then in November, they added 10 more sectors in just one go, 10 more product groups. It was not clear what was the thinking that went into those 10 product groups, what was the rationale, what is the kind of analysis that has gone into it. So then people can argue and debate and have a discussion. So that kind of a system lends itself to a greater deviation from theory to practice. And similar, perhaps, argument can be made about the anti-dumping duty that we discussed today. And in various sectors, we are seeing concentration of market power. HHI index has been rising in various sectors. And there are things that are going on which are not so obvious in terms of their economic rationale and the impact that is happening on the economy. And papers like these, I think, are very important to shed light and then kind of suggest better course of action. And I think this is an important contribution. And I would recommend all the listeners to please go and read this paper. The link to the paper will be provided along with the podcast on the page of this podcast episode. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Abhishek, and thank you, Naveen.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Suresh.
We'll be back soon with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. See you next time.